Story 1. Mystery locked in the abandoned Elmwood house. I was 16 when the veil of childhood wonder was brutally torn away by the grim reality of what my friends and I found in the Elmwood house. Now, at 33, I can still remember that day like it was yesterday. Connor, April, and I, we were inseparable back then, a trio against the world. The neighborhood was our kingdom, but within it, there stood a creepy house at the end of the street. The old couple, Mr. and Mrs. Elmwood, were like characters from a scary Disney story, mysterious and rarely seen. After Mr. Elmwood passed, Mrs. Elmwood's mind seemed to unravel. She'd wander out at strange hours. She seemed to talk to herself while aimlessly pacing around in the yard, and on a few occasions was seen standing motionless in her front window, just staring out into the street. She rarely got visitors, and when they came, they often didn't stay long. Parents in the neighborhood warned their kids to steer clear of her in the house, and we obliged, not out of respect, but more out of a bone-deep fear. Time marched on, and eventually Mrs. Elmwood passed on as well, leaving the house abandoned, with nature slowly reclaiming it, and the small yard surrounding it. Despite years of caution, the mystery of the old house eventually became too tempting. One afternoon, bored and overflowing with teenage fearlessness, Connor, April, and I crossed that unspoken boundary and stepped into what remained of the Elmwood home. Sneaking in through what was left of the back door, immediately April wanted to leave. With some reassurance, however, Connor and I were able to convince her to continue. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the dust of forgotten years. The wallpaper peeled away in strips, revealing the crumbling plaster beneath, and cobwebs clung to every corner of the dilapidated house. In one room, the ceiling had sprung a leak and caved in after many years of decay. In another room, however, there was something far more interesting. There was a particular closet, stubbornly sealed, like it was keeping the darkest secrets of the house. We tried our best to get it open, but it wouldn't budge. After putting forth our best attempt to open it, we finally gave up for the day and left. Days later, still haunted by that locked closet, we decided to break it open. The idea of going at night seemed more exciting, more challenging, I guess you could say. In hindsight, it was foolish. The darkness did things to the Elmwood house. It transformed it. Gone was the benign neglect of the daylight, replaced by an ominous, foreboding aura that made our skin crawl and set our hearts pounding. We arrived armed with flashlights and the kind of determination that only the ignorance of youth can inspire. That closet was like a beacon calling us to it. We had to know what was inside. It was Connor who took the lead, his foot connecting with the door in a solid thud. The sound of his blow reverberated through the house, bouncing off the walls and coming back to us like it was amplified. "I don't like this," April said with an unmistakable tremble in her voice. Ignoring her, Connor kicked it again. He delivered blow after blow, his resolve never waning, until finally the lock could hold no longer and gave way in a climactic burst. Connor and I postured for the best handle we could get on the door and jerked on it, finally slinging it open. As we shone our flashlights in, it took us a few seconds to get a handle on what it was that we were looking at. Upon realization, April screamed and stumbled backwards. Without a second thought, she turned and sprinted towards the back door. Connor, usually the bravest of us, yelled out, "Oh my God!" and stumbled back as well. As for me, I was frozen in place, terrified and eyes wide open, trying to process what I was looking at. Inside, there were 4 large shelves. Each of them was filled with dozens of jars. Inside the jars were animal parts, suspended in preserving liquid, gazing out at us. A pig's foot here, chicken feet there, and a jar of what looked like eyeballs that seemed to follow our every move. It was the most terrifying and grotesque thing that any of us had ever seen in our young lives. "I'm done," Connor yelled out. "I'm done, man. I'm leaving." He wasn't alone. I was done too, and we left immediately. The following days were a mess. April didn't want to talk to us. Connor ignored the subject, and I couldn't shake the vision of that closet out of my head. Eventually, we all 3 came around and decided not to bring it up again and not to tell anybody what we did or what happened. After all, we were trespassing. The house was eventually taken over by someone with no knowledge of its past and renovated into a sterile shadow of its former self. I guess it's safe to assume that the contents of the closet were found and disposed of properly. Connor, April, and I moved on, but the bond of that night and the fear stayed with us. Now, years later, whenever I go to visit my parents, I always sneak a look down to the end of the street where the Elmwood house once stood. I can't help but think about that night and some of the questions that will forever linger in my head. What in the hell were those jars doing in there? What purpose did they serve, and where did the animal parts come from? It seems that the answers, unfortunately, will forever be kept with Mr. and Mrs. Elmwood. Story 2. That one abandoned shack across the street and over the hill. When I was a kid, I lived just outside the city, surrounded by beautiful sprawling woods all around. I loved living in the woods, and my friend Ted, who lived down the gravel road, was my partner in crime, my fellow adventurer in the great outdoors that was our backyard. He would often make his way over, and at some point, we would find ourselves in the woods using sticks for swords or climbing a little bit too high in some of the trees. One sunny afternoon, my dad came out, keys in hand, and said he and my mom were heading into town to run some errands. His eyes met mine, stern and unwavering, as he reminded me of the one rule that had always stood: play in the woods behind our house, but never cross the street to the woods over the hill. I nodded, the image of obedience as they drove away. The moment their car disappeared, a rebellious spark ignited within me. "Ted," I said, "do you want to know why we can't go across the street?" His eyes perked up a little bit as he turned and looked at me. "I don't know. Why?" he asked. I looked back at him with a devious smile on my face and said, "I don't know either, but there's only one way to find out." Ted hesitated, reminding me of my dad's warning, but curiosity is a powerful thing, and soon we were sneaking across the street, our hearts pounding with the thrill of the forbidden. At first, the woods didn't look any different from what was out behind my house, but as we ventured deeper in, they seemed to grow quieter and darker, as if an ominous cloud was lingering above, blocking out the sun's beautiful rays. Ted, feeling the unease, suggested we turn back, but I wasn't ready to give up on the mystery. We wandered deeper and deeper. Finally, just as we were about to give up and head home, something in the distance caught my eye, a shape that didn't belong. It was an abandoned shack, decrepit and eerie, with broken-out windows and exterior walls that were barely holding together. Ted wanted to leave, but there was something about the shack that called me in, like a moth to a flame. "Just a quick look," I promised, and we approached the opening slowly and cautiously. There was only a board for a door, and we slid it to the side pretty easily. Inside, the floor was just dirt. On the interior walls, though, were what looked to be some type of ritualistic symbols and markings that made the hairs on my neck stand up. In the center, the earth looked disturbed, as if hiding a secret just beneath its surface. Without thinking, we knelt down and began to dig with our hands, slowly at first, but then faster and faster as the ground began to give way to whatever it was hiding. Eventually, its holdings came into clear view. What we found sent us both into shock. A large bone from a leg. Ted, wide-eyed and pale, looked at me slowly and whispered, "I think this is human." Panic surged through me, and we jumped up and fled the shack as if the devil himself were on our heels. As we ran, a movement caught my eye, a shadowy figure lurking behind some brush in the distance. I told Ted, but we didn't stop, and didn't look back until we were safe at home, chests heaving, our minds racing with fear. We argued about whether or not to tell my dad, but as his car pulled up, the truth spilled out. I told my dad everything: the shack, the bone, the figure. He wasn't happy, but he listened, his face turning serious as he dialed the sheriff. What followed was a blur of blue uniforms and flashing lights. Night settled in as multiple officers made their way back towards the abandoned shack. As the officers conducted their thorough investigation, sifting through the evidence with a mix of apprehension and professionalism, they did indeed uncover a collection of bones. Initially, There was a wave of concern at the possibility of human remains being found. However, after careful examination, it was determined that the bones were not human. Instead, they belonged to various animals, suggesting a different, though still unsettling, use of the shack. Still, it was no place for kids, and after a few short days, it was torn down. I wasn't punished, not really. My dad said the scare we got was punishment enough, and I had done the right thing by coming clean. As for the mysterious figure, looking back, I think it was probably just a figment of my imagination, something I conjured up in my head in the panic of the moment. We never saw anybody come around, and whoever it was that was using the shack was never found. Not that I believe that anybody was actually looking for him or her or whoever. The ordeal was terrifying and a lesson hard learned. I understood then, perhaps for the first time, the wisdom in my father's words and the protection in his rules. Though the shack is long gone, the memory of that day is ingrained in my mind. Many years later, Ted and I are still friends, and often bring up the story about that one abandoned shack, across the street and over the hill. Story 3. You know what this is. I'd been a pizza delivery person for about a year and a half, and had seen my fair share of odd delivery locations. Most deliveries, though, were standard. A delivery to a house, a place of business, places of that nature. One night, though, I took an order I'll never forget. It was the scariest situation I'd ever been through, and I learned a tough lesson that day. Orders that day were pretty straightforward, but as evening turned into night, I received one that, at least for me, was pretty unusual. I was to deliver to an address that turned out to be an old, abandoned building. The customer had left a note, saying the place was under new ownership and about to be renovated. The man would be working through the night and needed the pizza delivered to the address. I shrugged it off, thinking that the explanation sounded reasonable enough to me. As I pulled up to the building, though, something in my gut told me that something bad was going to happen. The building turned out to be an old car repair shop with multiple garage bay doors. It was dark, eerily silent, and had no lights on. The instructions were to enter through a garage door that was cracked open about 4 feet. As I sat in my car, I looked over and saw the door. Just as the instructions stated, it was cracked open. Maybe I'll just leave the pizza by the door, I thought to myself. Checking the order, though, I saw that it hadn't yet been paid for. Damn it, I said under my breath. Wanting to just get the order fulfilled and over with, I began to exit my vehicle. But as I did, something came over me. I couldn't tell you what it was, but it made me do something I'd never done before. I called my buddy Caleb. "Hey," I said to him, "I know this is weird and out of nowhere, but I got a bad feeling about this place I'm about to deliver to." I quickly explained the situation, gave him the address, and told him to call the cops if he didn't hear back from me in 5 minutes. He started bombarding me with questions, but I told him to just do it, and after he agreed, I hung up. Taking a deep breath, I left my car running, got out, and ducked under the door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the vast empty space. "Yo," a voice called out from the back. "Come on over." It was a man's voice, friendly, almost too friendly. I felt a knot in my stomach tighten. "Sorry about the lights. The electricity's not fixed yet," the voice called out. I didn't buy it for a second. Despite every instinct screaming at me to leave, I walked towards the voice, wanting to get this delivery over with. As I inched over, I could barely make out a man in the distance, standing beside what looked to be a desk. After about 8 or 10 steps, suddenly, the garage door slammed shut behind me. I spun around and saw a large silhouette blocking the only exit. A fear inside me that I had never felt was unlocked, and my heart pounded in my chest as the man slowly approached me. In his hand, he held a knife. "You know what this is," he said menacingly. He ordered me to walk towards the back of the shop, where the other man stood by a desk, barely visible from the little bit of light filtering in from the outside. They demanded my wallet and phone. Trembling, I handed them over. The guy that had been standing by the desk filtered through my wallet, angered by what little was in it. Just $2 and a debit card. $2 and a debit card? That's it? No credit cards?" he barked. I don't have any," I stammered, my body shaking like a jackhammer. The man glanced over my shoulder, in the direction of my car that was still outside running. My mind raced with fear, and I began to feel sick. "Looks like we're taking a trip to the ATM then," he said. Just then, headlights swept in from the street and into the parking lot. The men were momentarily distracted, and I seized my chance. I threw the pizza down and bolted towards the garage door, pounding on it and screaming, "It's the cops! In here! Help! Help!" I continued to pound on the door, while looking for a way to open it. The cops, alerted by Caleb, had arrived just in time. They managed to help me open the door, but the two men had vanished into the night. My wallet, everything in it, and my phone were left behind on the desk. I guess they didn't think the $2 and a debit card were enough to mess with. The officers checked on me, and I was a shaking mess, barely able to speak. The relief of being safe, yet the terror of what could have happened, overwhelmed me. The men did well to cover their tracks. The call to the pizza shop was made from a 68-year-old woman's phone. As she put it, she was approached by an intimidating man on the street that said the battery in his phone had died and requested if he could use hers. She felt unnerved but relented, and as the man was finishing up his call, much to her relief, a couple rounded the corner and approached the two. Seeing this, the man handed the phone back over and walked away. The description of the man matched the person I had seen standing over by the desk. Unfortunately, the police were never able to locate the men. There was something else that happened too. Caleb, my guardian angel that night, did something that I didn't ask him to do, and it probably saved my life. Instead of waiting 5 minutes to call the cops, he only waited about 20 seconds. "I could tell in your voice that something was really wrong," he said. That's how the cops got there so soon. Had he actually waited 5 minutes, the cops might have been too late. That was the last abandoned building I would ever take an order for. I should have known better than to try to make that delivery. Fortunately for me, though, I'll have the opportunity to not make the same mistake again.